It's not water. Whatever is turning that wheel is not water. And the silence is right outside the door. And if I stop the mill, if I let the wheel go still, it will get in. It will get into the quiet between my thoughts, and I won't be able to. Now, you settle in. You pull that blanket up just a little higher, and you listen close, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to be written down. It was only ever meant to be whispered. One mouth to one ear. One generation leaning in toward the next in the dark. And when the last person who carried the truth about Hollow Tooth Creek moved away from that valley, the knowing went with them. Almost. His name was Martin Creel, retired, 63 years old, mechanical engineer, spent 40 years in Cincinnati figuring out why machines failed. Turbines mostly, gear trains, load-bearing systems under stress. He understood the language of moving parts the way some men understand the scriptures. He could hear a bearing going wrong from across a factory floor, could feel a misaligned shaft through the rubber soles of his work boots. Machines talked to him. He had spent a whole life listening, which is why, when he arrived at the property on the 3rd of September, a mill inherited from a great uncle he had met exactly once at a funeral when Martin was 9 years old, the very first thing he noticed was not the condition of the structure, not the missing clapboards on the western face, not the soft rot creeping up the sluice gate, not even the smell, that damp, gray, mineral smell of old water pressed against older wood. The first thing Martin Creel noticed was that the mill was already running. The wheel was turning, slow and steady, turning in that gray mountain light like it had been turning for 100 years and intended to turn for 100 more. And the millstone inside, he could hear it through the plank walls, that low, continuous groan, patient, rhythmic, turning and turning with a sound like something very large breathing in its sleep. He stood in the gravel yard and listened for a long time. Then he walked around to the creek side. Now, I want you to pay attention here, because this is where a reasonable man, and Martin Creel was a very reasonable man, this is where he should have put his bag back in his truck, driven to the county seat, and signed whatever paper made that property somebody else's concern. But reasonable men do not always do the reasonable thing when their curiosity gets a hold of them. And Martin Creel's curiosity had been a hold of him his entire life. It was, by his own accounting, the only thing about himself he had never learned to manage. He crouched at the bank. He watched the water driving the wheel. He watched it the way an engineer watches something, patient and methodical, and looking for the thing that doesn't fit, looking for the deviation. He watched for 11 minutes. He counted. Later, in the log he kept on his phone, he recorded the duration precisely, the way a man records things he needs to stay certain about. The water was flowing uphill, not fast, not dramatically. The way a lie doesn't look like a lie the very first time you hear it told. But the surface tension was wrong. The eddies curled backward. Whatever was moving along that creek bed and pressing against those paddle boards, it was moving from the valley floor up toward the ridge, against gravity, against logic, against every principle of fluid mechanics that Martin Creel had spent 4 decades applying in service of other people's machines. He sat back on his heels in the gravel, and he listened to that millstone turn. And he thought, something is powering this that I do not understand yet. That is exactly the kind of thought that keeps a mechanical engineer on a property he should have left before dark. The first night he slept in his truck, not from fear. He told himself it was practical. The interior needed airing. The electricity had not been switched on. The bedding inside would be damp and close. He told himself these practical things while he locked the truck doors and checked them a second time, while he kept the engine running far longer than the cold required, while he watched the mill from behind the windshield in the dark, without really deciding to. The wheel turned all night. He could hear it, even through the glass, that slow groan of the stone, that rhythmic, patient sound that should have been mechanical, should have been predictable and regular the way mechanical things are, but kept shifting just slightly, just barely enough that he could not settle into it. Every time his eyes drew heavy, the rhythm changed, not faster, not slower, just different in some quality he could not name, the way a voice changes just before it says the thing it has been working up to saying. He did not sleep that first night. The second day he went inside. The interior of the mill was in considerably better condition than the outside suggested. The main grinding floor was dry. The gearing, a beautiful old arrangement of wooden cogs and iron pinions he recognized from the style as late 19th century construction, was intact and recently oiled. He could smell the oil. Fresh, not rancid. Someone had been maintaining this equipment. Someone had been on this property not very long ago, keeping this machine running for reasons Martin had not yet identified. But there was no grain, no hopper, no collecting trough beneath the stone, no meal residue, no grain sacks, nothing to indicate that this mill had ever processed anything a person might eat. The millstone turned and turned, with nothing between the stones to grind. He pressed his ear carefully against the wooden housing around the stone, and he listened. The way you describe something you're not sure you have words for. What he heard was not what he expected. No grinding of grit on grit. No scrape of hard things being made into smaller, softer things. What he heard was a sound like breathing, but inverted. Like air was being drawn out of something rather than pushed through it. A deep, rhythmic drawing sound. A sound of hunger without a mouth. And beneath that, beneath the wheel and the stone and the gearing, a hum, low and constant. The kind of hum you feel registering in your back teeth before your ears properly catch it. He spent the remainder of that afternoon reading through the documents that had arrived with the property deed. A letter from the estate attorney. The deed itself going back to 1887. A survey of the land boundaries that didn't fully agree with any map he could find on his phone. And a handwritten document, no letterhead, no title, stapled to the back of the deed on paper that was dry and brown at the edges, that he almost missed entirely, almost skipped without reading. It began, "Whoever comes next must understand what the mill is for, because it is not for grain, and it was never for grain." Martin Creel was not a superstitious man. He had no patience for what he privately called decorative thinking, the human tendency to stitch meaning onto random patterns, to mistake coincidence for intention. He believed in causes. He believed in mechanisms. He believed that every observed effect had an origin that could, with sufficient investigation, be precisely understood. But he read that unsigned document 3 times. Then he set it down and sat with it for a while. Then he picked it up and read it once more. It described the valley, Hollow Tooth Creek and the 6 or 8 side hollows that fed into it, as a place with a particular problem. Not a geological problem, not a hydrological problem, a silence problem. The document used that word the way another document might use the word infection or the word infestation. Something that spread if left unmanaged. The hungry silence, it called it, was a presence. Not a creature in any way Martin's mind wanted to arrange that word. Not a spirit in any conventional sense his upbringing would have offered him. It was described over and again as a condition, an actively predatory condition that existed in the spaces between sounds, in the still air between one spoken word and the next, in the dark between one breath and the breath that follows it, in the particular quality of quiet that settles into a hollow after midnight, when the frogs stop and the insects stop, and the whole mountain holds its breath for reasons it does not share. The hungry silence, the document said, was not interested in your body. It was interested in the quiet inside your body, the silence between your thoughts, the half-second pause between deciding to speak and beginning to speak. And if it ever found a way in, if it slipped through some crack in the continuous noise a living person makes simply by existing, it would fill that interior silence with itself, and you would grow very still, and you would not come back from that stillness, and the people around you would say you had become distant, or say you had always been quiet, or say nothing much at all, because the truth of it had no shape in ordinary language. The mill was the solution, had always been the solution, but not in the way Martin expected. The mill did not grind grain. The mill ground the silence of the valley. It took the deep quiet that accumulated in the hollows, the old mineral geological quiet of stone and shadow and still air, and it worked it, processed it, converted it. The stone turned and turned, and the raw silence passed between the grinding faces and came out the other side as that low, continuous hum, rendered harmless, spread thin across the whole valley the way a small fire, properly tended, can hold back a very large cold. As long as the wheel turned, the valley had enough sound in the air to stay safe, enough hum in the ground, enough low, constant noise in the spaces between things to deny the hungry silence the entry points it needed. And what turned the wheel? Along this pause yet. The document used a word Martin didn't recognize, an old mountain word with no clean English translation. He searched for it later and found only fragments, only approximations. The closest he could render it was something like the wanting of still water to become otherwise. The creek flowed uphill because the water itself understood, on whatever level water understands anything, what it was participating in. The mill worked because every stone and every board and every gear in that valley grasped, in the wordless way that old things grasp things, that the alternative was far, far worse than flowing against gravity. Martin Creel sat in that mill for a long time after he finished reading. He is not a man given to sitting still. His daughter will tell you that freely. He's a man who, when presented with a problem, immediately begins inventorying available tools. Sitting simply sitting with something he could not yet begin to solve, was genuinely difficult for him. But he sat, and while he sat, he listened. And after a while, an hour, perhaps longer, he lost track. He noticed something that tightened his chest in a way he did not have an engineering term for. When the millstone's hum was at its fullest, when the wheel held its rhythm and the sound filled the room completely, he felt ordinary. He felt like a man sitting in an old building, thinking, in no particular danger. But when the rhythm shifted, when the sound thinned for even a half-second, even barely, something happened to the quality of his thoughts. A drawing sensation at the very edge of his mind, like the quiet inside his head had developed a weight, a direction, like it had somewhere it was trying to go. He stood up very quickly when he felt that. He walked outside. He stood in the gray yard and breathed loudly on purpose. He hummed tunelessly. He spoke aloud to no one, said his own name, his daughter's name, the names of machines he'd worked on in Cincinnati, the names of streets he'd lived on, anything with sound in it, anything to put noise back in the air immediately around his body. Then he went back inside and he read the final page of the document. The last page was maintenance instructions. There is a specific stone in the housing of the millstone that must be replaced on a 5-year schedule, because the grinding wears it down, and when it thins past a certain tolerance, the hum shifts frequency and loses its effectiveness. There is a pinion gear that requires re-greasing every 18 months. There is a precise alignment of the sluice gate, noted in hand-drawn measurements, with a margin of no more than 1/4 inch, that must be maintained, or the water, or whatever it truly is, will not press against the paddles with sufficient force to keep the stone at working speed. Page after page of tolerances, schedules, measurements noted in a hand that had grown progressively smaller and more cramped toward the end, as though the writer had been working in dim light, or declining patience, or something else entirely. The kind of information you only record if you expect someone to need it. The kind of information you give an engineer. Martin Creel, 63 years old, retired from 4 decades of keeping other people's machines running, sat in an inherited mill on a creek that ran uphill, and understood, quietly and completely, that he had not inherited a property. He had inherited a responsibility. He is there now, in case you were wondering. Still there, as of the last word I have. He sends his daughter emails when the connection permits it. He has told her the countryside is beautiful, and that he is doing restoration work on a building, which is true enough in its way. He does not tell her about the maintenance log he keeps on his phone, or about the nights when the rhythm shifts and he goes outside in the dark and talks to himself, just to keep noise in the air around his body. He does not tell her that some mornings the quiet inside the mill is so thick it feels like something is leaning against it from the outside. And he does not tell her what he understood, finally, about his great-uncle, who lived alone in that valley for 34 years, and who, toward the very end of his life, had almost entirely stopped speaking. Not because he had become a quiet man by nature or by choice, but because the spaces between his words had grown very large over a very long time, and something patient and hungry and absolutely silent had learned to live in them.